The snow fell like ash that December evening in 1944, covering the blood-stained fields of eastern France in a blanket of forgiveness the war had not yet earned. Franz Kepler pressed his cracked lips together, tasting copper and defeat, as the American transport truck rattled over frozen roads toward what he assumed would be his final destination. He was 23 years old, though his eyes carried the weight of someone twice that age. Beside him sat Otto Brenner, a farmhand from Bavaria who still clutched a photograph of his daughter, even though the image had faded to ghostly outlines. On Franz's other side was young Wilhelm, barely 18, who hadn't spoken since the surrender 3 days prior. The truck bed held 12 German soldiers, all that remained of a company that had numbered 60 just 2 weeks earlier. They wore the shame of their uniform like a second skin, the gray fabric torn and muddied, the once proud insignias now symbols of a crumbling empire. None of them knew where they were being taken, only that the Americans had separated them from the larger group of prisoners, the quiet ones, the ones who hadn't fought when surrender came. Franz wondered if this meant mercy, or if it meant something worse, a quiet execution away from witnesses, a shallow grave in frozen ground that wouldn't thaw until spring revealed their bones. The truck slowed, then stopped. Franz heard voices outside, American accents mixing with something else, something local and French. The canvas flap at the back of the truck pulled aside, and cold air rushed in with the face of a U.S. sergeant, weathered and tired, holding a clipboard like it was a script for a play no one wanted to perform. "All right, you 12, the sergeant said in broken German. "Out. Slow. Hands where I can see them." They climbed down into ankle-deep snow, their boots crunching in the silence of a world holding its breath. Franz looked around and saw not a prison camp or an execution site, but a farmhouse. It stood alone on a hillside, smoke rising from its chimney in a steady promise of warmth. The house was stone and timber, probably 200 years old, with shutters painted blue that had faded to the color of forget-me-nots. A barn sat behind it, and beyond that, fields stretched toward a forest of naked trees that looked like skeletal hands reaching for heaven. "This way," the sergeant said, gesturing toward the house. His rifle hung loose on his shoulder, not aimed, not threatening. Beside him stood a man in civilian clothes, a farmer, clearly, with hands like oak roots and a face carved by weather and time. He was perhaps 60, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to see through the uniforms to the men beneath. He wore a wool coat and held his cap in his hands, turning it slowly as he studied the prisoners. The farmer spoke in French to the sergeant, who nodded and turned back to the Germans. "This is Henri Beaumont. His farm, his rules. You work, you eat. You run, you die. Simple." But there was something in Henri's expression that contradicted the sergeant's harsh words, something that made Franz's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name, because he'd forgotten what hope felt like. Henri stepped forward and spoke directly to them in German, accented but clear. "Welcome to my home. The war has taken much from all of us. Tonight, we eat together." Wilhelm made a sound, something between a laugh and a sob. Otto's hand trembled against the photograph in his pocket. Franz felt the ground shift beneath him, not from the snow, but from the impossibility of what he'd just heard. Executed men don't get welcomed. Executed men don't get invited to dinner. Henri led them toward the house, and the American sergeant lit a cigarette, watching with an expression Franz couldn't read. As they approached the door, Franz noticed details that spoke of a life interrupted by war. A garden plot buried under snow, a child's wooden horse leaning against the barn, a clothesline with no clothes, just empty pins holding on to nothing. The door opened, and warmth poured out along with the smell of bread and stew, and something inside Franz, something he thought had died in a trench near Bastogne, began to wake. Inside the farmhouse, the world transformed. The prisoners stood in the doorway, uncertain, as Henri gestured for them to remove their boots. It was such a domestic act, such a normal human thing, that Franz felt disoriented. He unlaced his boots with fingers stiff from cold and malnutrition, aware that his socks had holes and his feet bore the marks of trench rot that hadn't fully healed. Around him, the other men did the same, creating a small mountain of worn leather and shame by the door. The kitchen was the heart of the house, with a massive stone fireplace dominating one wall. A long wooden table stretched through the center, scarred by generations of meals and marked with the rings of countless cups. 3 oil lamps cast golden light across the room, and in that glow, Franz saw her, Henri's wife Marguerite, standing by the stove with a ladle in her hand and an expression of such complex emotion that Franz had to look away. She was a small woman, bird-like in her movements, with gray hair pinned in a bun and an apron that had been mended many times. Her eyes were red, not from crying, but from onions, Franz realized, seeing them chopped on the cutting board. They sat carefully, as if the furniture might reject them, as if this kindness might be a trick. Franz found himself between Otto and a man named Klaus, a former schoolteacher who had taught history before the war made him part of it. Across from him sat Wilhelm, whose eyes kept darting to the door as if planning escape, even though there was nowhere to run and no reason to leave warmth for the winter night. Henri moved to the head of the table while Marguerite brought out a pot of stew, chicken and vegetables, the smell of which made Franz's stomach cramp with longing. Behind her came another figure, and Franz felt his breath catch. A girl, perhaps 16, with dark hair and braids and her father's steady eyes. She carried bread wrapped in cloth, and when she set it down, her hands shook slightly. Her name, Franz would learn, was Sophie. "This is my daughter," Henri said quietly. "She does not speak, not since the occupation." The weight of those words settled over the table like a second meal, one that tasted of ash and regret. Franz understood immediately what Henri was saying. The Germans had been here before. His army, his countrymen, had done something that stole this girl's voice. And yet here they sat, at her father's table, about to break bread with the very people who represented her trauma. Marguerite began ladling stew into bowls, moving down the table with mechanical precision. When she reached Franz, their eyes met, and he saw everything there. The loss, the anger, the exhaustion, and beneath it all, something that looked like defiance. As if by feeding them, by treating them as human, she was refusing to let the war turn her into something hard and unforgiving. Henri stood at the head of the table, his hands resting on the wood. "Before we eat, we pray. In this house, we remember that God sees all men, not just their uniforms." He bowed his head, and slowly, uncertainly, the prisoners did the same. "Lord, we ask for peace. We ask for healing. We ask that you help us see each other as you see us, broken, lost, and seeking our way home. Amen." "Amen," murmured some of the men, the words strange in their mouths after so much silence. They ate. It was not a comfortable meal, but it was a real one. The stew was simple but prepared with care. Chicken that probably been one of their precious hens, potatoes from the cellar, carrots that had survived the early frost. The bread was dark rye, dense and filling, spread with butter that tasted like luxury after months of stale rations. Franz ate slowly, trying to make it last, trying to remember the last time food had been more than fuel for survival. Otto wept quietly as he ate, tears mixing with his stew, and no one commented because they understood. Wilhelm finally spoke, his first words in 3 days, asking softly if he might have more bread. Sophie brought it to him, her footsteps silent, and placed it beside his bowl with such gentleness that Wilhelm's face crumbled and he had to turn away. After the meal, Henri stood and addressed them properly. "You will sleep in the barn tonight. It is warm there, with the animals. Tomorrow, you work. My farm has been neglected. One old man cannot maintain what two sons once did." His voice caught on that last word, and Franz understood another piece of the puzzle. Sons, past tense. "They died?" Klaus asked quietly, the teacher in him needing to understand the full story. Henri nodded. "Jacques was killed at Dunkirk in 1940. Michel disappeared during the occupation. The Germans said he was sent to a labor camp in the east. We have heard nothing for 2 years." He looked at each of them in turn. "I do not know if you are the men who took my son, but I know that somewhere, perhaps my Michel sits at a table like this, and I hope someone shows him the mercy I show you tonight." The silence that followed was profound. Franz felt it pressing on his chest, making it hard to breathe. This man had lost both his sons to this war, and yet he had set places at his table for enemy soldiers. Franz had been raised in Berlin, taught that the French were weak, that the Slavs were subhuman, that Germany's destiny was to rule. But sitting in this kitchen, seeing this family's quiet strength, he felt the lies crumbling like the Third Reich itself. "Why?" Franz asked. "Why show us kindness?" Henri looked at him for a long moment. "Because someone must stop the cycle. Because hatred is a fire that consumes everything, and I am tired of burning. Because you are young men far from home, and I am an old man who has seen what bitterness does to the soul." He paused, then added, "And because my wife asked me to. She said, 'Henri, we can let the war make us into monsters, or we can remain human, but we cannot be both.'" Marguerite spoke for the first time, her voice rough with emotion. "My sons were good boys. They did not want to fight. The war took them anyway. If they are alive, I hope someone remembers they are human. I hope someone feeds them. I hope someone sees past their uniform to the person beneath." She looked directly at Franz. "You have a mother?" "Yes," Franz whispered. "Then for her sake, I feed you, mother to mother, across the distance." The barn was indeed warm, heated by the body warmth of 3 cows, a horse, and several goats that regarded the new arrivals with mild curiosity. Hay had been spread in the loft, and old blankets provided, thin but clean. As Franz climbed the ladder, he noticed things that spoke of preparation. Someone had swept this space, arranged the hay into 12 separate sleeping areas, left a bucket of water and a basin for washing. This was not improvised kindness. This was planned mercy. The men settled in quietly, too exhausted and emotionally overwhelmed to speak much. But as darkness deepened and the sounds of the house below faded, Otto broke the silence. "I had a farm," he said to no one in particular. "Smaller than this, 30 acres, dairy cows and chickens. My daughter would collect the eggs every morning, singing to the hens. I wonder if anyone is singing to them now."
"Your family? They're alive?" asked Klaus. "I don't know. I was conscripted in 43. They were still there when I left, but the letters stopped 6 months ago." Otto's voice broke. "I don't know if they stopped writing or if they're gone." Wilhelm spoke from his corner. "My mother used to set up an extra place at Christmas. For travelers," she said, "for strangers who might need shelter. I always thought it was silly. We never had travelers." He was quiet for a moment. "Tonight, I was a stranger. I was in an extra place." Franz listened to these confessions in the dark, feeling the weight of their shared guilt and grief. They were not monsters, though they had served a monstrous regime. They were farmers and teachers and sons, caught in the machinery of war, and now sitting in the wreckage of their choices, trying to understand how they had arrived at this barn, this moment, this strange and terrible grace. The days that followed established a rhythm that felt like healing, though none of them dared name it that. They woke before dawn to the sound of Henri's footsteps in the yard. They worked, repairing fences damaged by winter storms, mucking out the barn, chopping firewood that had been left too long and needed splitting, clearing snow from the paths and the roof. The work was hard but honest. the kind that left muscles aching and minds clear. Henri worked beside them, showing them where the repairs were needed, demonstrating the way he wanted things done. He was a patient teacher, correcting them without criticism, explaining the reasons behind each task. The fence here, we make it strong because the forest has wolves. They do not come often, but when they are hungry, they test our defenses. Or, the firewood we stack this way so the air flows through. Wet wood makes smoke, and smoke makes my wife cough. Marguerite fed them 3 times a day, breakfast of porridge and eggs, lunch of bread and cheese brought to the fields, dinner of whatever she could make with their dwindling supplies. Marguerite fed them 3 times a day, breakfast of porridge and eggs, lunch of bread and cheese brought to the fields, dinner of whatever she could make with their dwindling supplies. Marguerite fed them 3 times a day, breakfast of porridge and eggs, lunch of bread and cheese brought to the fields, dinner of whatever she could make with their dwindling supplies. Marguerite fed them 3 times a day, breakfast of porridge and eggs, lunch of bread and cheese brought to the fields, dinner of whatever she could make with their dwindling supplies. Marguerite fed them 3 times a day, breakfast of porridge and eggs, lunch of bread and cheese brought to the fields, dinner of whatever she could make with their dwindling supplies. Franz noticed the portions she served herself and Sophie were smaller than what she gave the prisoners, and it shamed him. When he mentioned it to Henri, the farmer shrugged. "We eat less because we have eaten more over our lifetime. You boys are thin as rails. You need building up." Sophie moved through the days like a ghost, her silence a constant reminder of what the war had stolen. She helped her mother with the cooking, tended the chickens and collected eggs that she placed in a basket with such care that Franz understood she was trying to preserve something fragile in a world that had broken so much. Sometimes she caught him watching them work, her expression unreadable, and he wanted to apologize, to explain that he hadn't wanted this war, hadn't chosen to invade her country, but the words stayed trapped in his throat, inadequate and too late. The American sergeant, whose name was Thompson, came by every few days to check on them. He would walk the property with Henri, counting prisoners, ensuring no one had escaped. But his visits became less about enforcement and more about conversation. Franz heard them talking one afternoon as he repaired a section of the chicken coop. "You're doing something dangerous here, Henri," Thompson said in English, which Henri understood better than he spoke. "Fraternizing with the enemy. Some people won't understand. Some people have not lost what I have lost. Some people do not know that revenge is just another word for pain that you pass to someone else." "Your brother, he would want you to hate," Henri asked gently. "No," Thompson admitted. "Danny would want me to help people. He was like that, always helping people." "Then honor him by helping. These men need to see that Americans are not what their propaganda told them. They need to see that we are all just trying to survive, trying to get home." That night, Thompson brought extra rations from the American supply depot, canned goods, dried milk, coffee, chocolate bars. He didn't explain, just left them with Henri and walked away quickly, as if the kindness embarrassed him. But not everyone shared Thompson's evolving perspective. On the 10th day, a group of men from the nearby village arrived at the farm. Franz was in the barn when he heard the shouting, angry French voices demanding to speak to Henri. He climbed down from the loft where he had been organizing hay and peered through a gap in the door. There were 6 of them, all men between 30 and 50, wearing the red armbands of the local resistance. Their leader was a man named Bernard, thick-necked and furious, gesturing violently at the house. "You shelter the enemy under your roof while our brothers die in camps. You feed them while our children go hungry. This is a collaboration, Henri. This is treason."
Henri stood in the doorway of his house, not backing down despite being outnumbered. "This is mercy, Bernard. Something you seem to have forgotten." "Mercy?" Bernard spat in the snow. "They showed no mercy to our people. They took our food, our wine, our lives. My cousin was shot for hiding Jewish children. Where was German mercy then?" "Your cousin was a hero," Henri said steadily, "and I honor his memory by refusing to become what we fought against. These men are prisoners.
assigned here by the Americans. They work. They do not cause trouble. Would you have me turn them out into the winter to die?" "Yes!" shouted one of the other men. "Let them die! Let them freeze! They are Nazis!" "They are men," Henri corrected. "Men who were drafted into a war not of their choosing. Boys who missed their families. Human beings who deserve the same dignity we wish for our own sons who are prisoners somewhere else." Bernard stepped closer, his face red with rage. "You are a fool, old man. A dangerous fool. The village will remember this. When the war is over and we account for collaborators, we will remember that you broke bread with Nazis." "Then remember it," Henri said quietly. "Remember that I chose humanity over hatred. Remember that I tried to plant seeds of peace instead of watering the garden of vengeance. And when you lie awake at night, ask yourself what your anger has built, Bernard. Ask yourself if your rage has brought back a single person we lost." The confrontation ended with Bernard spitting once more and leading his men away. But the threat hung in the air like smoke. Franz felt the danger of their situation more keenly now. They were not just prisoners in a barn. They were evidence of Henri's defiance. Targets in a larger conflict about what justice meant in the aftermath of occupation. That evening, the mood at dinner was subdued. Henri and Marguerite spoke quietly to each other in French, their words too fast for Franz to follow completely, but the tone was clear. Worry, disagreement, resolution. Sophie cleared the plates with more force than usual, her silence somehow louder than words. After the meal, Henri addressed the prisoners. "Today, men from the village came. They're angry that you are here. They do not understand what I am trying to do. I want you to know that I will not send you away, but I also want you to understand the risk for all of us. The war may be ending, but hatred has longer legs." Klaus, the schoolteacher, spoke up. "Perhaps we should ask to be transferred. We do not wish to bring harm to your family, Monsieur Beaumont." "Harm has already been done," Marguerite said sharply, speaking from the kitchen. "The war brought harm to everyone, but we choose what we do with that harm. We can let it poison us, or we can use it to grow something different." "Beautiful words," Odo said sadly, "but words do not stop angry men." "No," Henri agreed, "but actions do, and we will continue our actions. We will continue to show that another way is possible." The change came on the 16th day, during a snowstorm that turned the world white and erased the boundaries between earth and sky. The prisoners were working in the barn, insulated from the worst of the weather, when they heard a commotion from the house. Franz looked at Odo, and without words they both moved toward the barn door. Through the curtain of falling snow, they saw an American military vehicle in the yard. But not Thompson's usual truck. This was a jeep, and from it emerged two officers, their uniforms crisp despite the weather, their faces set in official expressions. Henri stood in the doorway, and even from a distance, Franz could see the tension in his shoulders. The conversation was too far away to hear, but the body language told a story. One officer was gesturing, reading from papers. Henri was shaking his head. Marguerite appeared behind her husband, and Sophie behind her mother, 3 generations of Beaumont women standing in the doorway like guardians of a threshold the officers wanted to cross. Wilhelm appeared beside Franz. "They're taking us away," he said flatly. "Someone complained. We're being transferred." "Maybe it's for the best," Klaus said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We've put this family in danger long enough." But Franz felt something clutching in his chest, a resistance to leaving this place that had become, impossibly, something like a refuge. In 16 days, he had begun to remember what it felt like to be human instead of just a soldier, to work for life instead of death, to sit at a table and share a meal instead of huddling in a trench, sharing only misery.
The officers left, and Henri trudged through the snow to the barn. His face was grave but determined. They want to move you to a larger camp, official prisoner facility. They say it's not proper for you to be here, working for a French civilian. They say, he paused, struggling with anger. They say I might be sympathizing with the enemy. We'll go, Franz said immediately. We don't want to cause you more trouble. No, Henri said firmly. You misunderstand. I told them no. I told them that you are assigned to me, that you work hard, that you have been no trouble. I told them that moving you now in the middle of winter, when the work is not yet done, would be wasteful. I told them, he smiled slightly, I told them that I am a French citizen, that we suffered under occupation, and that if I choose to accept prisoner labor, that is my right as a victim of their war. Otto laughed, a surprised bark of sound. You argued to keep us? I argued to keep my workers, Henri corrected, but his eyes were warm. Whether you are good workers or good men, well, that is something I am still determining. But the reprieve was temporary, and everyone knew it. The officers said they would return in 1 week with orders from higher command. Henri had bought them time, nothing more. That night, something shifted in the household. Perhaps it was the awareness that their time together was limited, or perhaps it was the simple human need to mark the meaningful before it disappears. But Henri brought out a bottle of wine from before the war. From 1938, he said, holding it up to the lamplight, the last good year before the darkness came. I was saving it for when Michel came home, but tonight we drink to the possibility of peace, even if my son is not here to share it. He poured small glasses for everyone, including the prisoners. The wine was dark and rich, tasting of earth and time and summers that had burned away in the fire of war. They drank slowly, savoring not just the wine but the moment itself. Marguerite told stories of her sons, Jacques, who loved mathematics and dreamed of being an engineer, Michel, who could identify every bird by its song and wanted to study biology. She spoke of their childhood, of the farm before the war, of the life that had been stolen from them. Her voice broke multiple times, but she kept speaking, as if by remembering aloud, she could keep them alive in some way. Sophie sat beside her mother, her silence a presence of its own. Franz noticed she was looking at him, her dark eyes steady and searching. When their gazes met, she didn't look away. Instead, she reached slowly for the small notepad she kept in her apron pocket and wrote something, then slid it across the table to him. Franz picked up the note with trembling fingers. In careful French script, she had written, "Are you sorry?" The question struck him like a physical blow. He looked at her, this girl whose voice had been stolen by his countrymen, this young woman asking the question that mattered most. He picked up the pencil she had left beside the note and wrote back in his careful schoolbook French, "Every day, every moment, I am so sorry." Sophie read his words, and something changed in her expression. Not forgiveness, it was too soon for that, too much had been taken, but acknowledgement, a recognition that he had answered honestly, that his regret was real. She took the pencil back and wrote again. "My brother Michel wore glasses. He was afraid of horses. He loved chocolate. Did you know men like him?" Franz wrote, "Yes, my friend Peter was like that. He died near Warsaw. He was 19. They passed the notepad back and forth while the adults talked, creating a conversation in silence that was more honest than many spoken aloud. Sophie asked him about his home, his family, what he had wanted to be before the war. Franz answered truthfully. He had wanted to be an architect, to build things instead of destroying them, to create spaces where families could feel safe. She told him, through her careful writing, that she had wanted to be a teacher like Klaus, that she loved poetry.
that before she stopped speaking, she had sung in the church choir. "Why did you stop?" Franz wrote, though he dreaded the answer. Sophie's hand paused over the paper. Then she wrote, "German soldiers came to the school. They were looking for resistance members. They asked us questions. I was 12. I didn't know anything, but I was frightened and I spoke when I shouldn't have. Because of what I said, they searched the wrong house. They didn't find what they were looking for there, but they found someone else who was hiding. A Jewish family. The parents and 3 children. They took them away. I heard them crying. After that, I decided my voice had done enough harm. I decided silence was safer." Franz's hands were shaking as he read. He wanted to tell her it wasn't her fault, that she had been a child, that the guilt belonged to the men who had weaponized her fear. But he couldn't write those words because his own guilt was too heavy. His uniform, even though he had personally done nothing at that school, connected him to the men who had. He was part of the machine that had created her silence. He wrote simply, "I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of your kindness in sharing this with me."
Sophie read his words and nodded once. Then she did something that made Franz's eyes burn with tears. She reached across the table and touched his hand. Just briefly, just for a moment. A gesture that said, "I see you. I see past the uniform to the person who regrets it. I see your humanity, even though you were part of the machinery that tried to destroy mine." The moment was broken by the sound of vehicles approaching. Multiple vehicles, more than before. Henri stood quickly, his face alarmed, and moved to the window. "Americans," he said, "many of them." The prisoners stood as well, uncertain, frightened. Had someone reported them? Had the villagers followed through on their threats? Franz's mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. But when the door opened, it was Thompson who entered, followed by 2 other soldiers carrying boxes. "Gentlemen," he said, addressing the room formally, "I come with news and with supplies." "What news?" Henri asked, his voice tight. Thompson set his cap on the table, a gesture of respect. "The war is not over, but it is ending. We are making progress on all fronts. Berlin will fall. It is only a matter of time." He looked at the prisoners. "Which means you men will eventually go home. And when you do, I want you to remember this place, this family. I want you to remember that not everyone treated you as the enemy." He opened the first box, revealing food supplies, real coffee, chocolate, canned meats, dried fruits, white flour, luxuries that the farm hadn't seen in years. "This is payment," Thompson said, "for the work these men have done, for the burden Monsieur Beaumont has carried." "I asked for no payment," Henri said. "I know. That's why you're getting it." Thompson smiled slightly. "Call it a gift from the U.S. Army to a family that has shown us what we're fighting for. A reminder of why we do this, so that people like you can rebuild, can live in peace, and can show mercy even when it costs something." He opened the second box, and this time his expression was different, more solemn, more personal. "This is harder news. We found records. In the camp at Bergen-Belsen, where we liberated prisoners last week." He pulled out papers, official documents, and Franz's blood ran cold. "We found your son, Monsieur Beaumont. Michel Beaumont, age 24, prisoner number 84721. Marguerite made a sound, something between a gasp and a prayer. Henri's face went white. "He was alive when the camp was liberated. He is in a hospital now, in Belgium. He is very sick, very weak, but he is alive, and he asked that we contact his family." He pulled out a letter, worn and stained. "He wrote this 3 months ago. It was never sent, but we found it among his things." Henri took the letter with shaking hands. He unfolded it carefully, as if it might dissolve at his touch. His eyes scanned the words and tears began to roll down his weathered cheeks. Marguerite pressed against his side, reading over his shoulder, her hand over her mouth.
Sophie stood frozen, then suddenly she was moving, running to her parents, and from her throat came a sound, small, broken, but real. A cry of joy, a release of 2 years of silence. "Papa," she whispered, the word cracking from disuse. "Papa, Michel is alive." The room erupted in emotion. Henri was weeping openly, Marguerite was laughing and crying simultaneously, and Sophie was speaking, broken, hesitant words pouring out like water from a dam that had finally burst. "When can we see him? When does he come home? Is he really alive?" Thompson gave them the details. Michel was at a field hospital in Brussels, recovering. He would need time, months perhaps, to regain his strength. But yes, he was alive. Yes, he would come home. In the midst of this joy, Franz felt something breaking and reforming in his chest. This family had fed him, sheltered him, treated him with dignity despite everything his nation had done to theirs. And their son had survived the camps that Franz's country had built. The mathematics of mercy and justice became too complex to calculate, too overwhelming to process. He stood and walked towards Henri, uncertain but compelled. "Monsieur Beaumont," he said quietly. Henri looked at him, his face still wet with tears. "Your son survived. Because of this, because of you showing us mercy when you had every right to hate us, I will remember. I will go home and I will tell people what you did. I will tell them that in the worst of times, a French farmer set an extra table for his enemies. I will tell them that his daughter found her voice again on the night he learned his son would come home. I will tell them that peace is possible, even after so much pain." Henri studied him for a long moment, then pulled him into an embrace. "Go home," he whispered in German. "Go home and be a good man. Build those buildings you dream of. Create beauty. Never stop being sorry, but also never stop trying to be better. That is how we heal the world. One choice at a time, one table at a time, one moment of mercy at a time." The week that followed transformed the farm from a place of quiet endurance into something that resembled celebration, though tempered by the awareness of all that had been lost. Sophie's voice grew stronger each day, hesitant at first, then gradually more confident. She sang while collecting eggs, her voice rusty but sweet, and Marguerite wept every time she heard it, unable to believe that this gift had been returned to them.
The prisoners worked with renewed purpose, driven by a desire to leave the farm better than they had found it. They knew their time was limited. Thompson had confirmed they would be transferred to a proper POW camp by week's end, and they wanted to give Henri and Marguerite something tangible, something that would last beyond their brief stay. Franz organized the men into teams. Otto and Wilhelm repaired the roof of the barn where winter had found weak spots, replacing boards and ensuring the space would stay dry through the spring thaws. Klaus and 2 others rebuilt the chicken coop, expanding it to hold more birds, creating nesting boxes that would make egg collection easier. Franz himself worked on the garden plot, clearing the dead growth from the previous season, turning the frozen soil, and preparing the beds for spring planting. Henri watched them work, with an expression that mingled gratitude and sadness. "You do not need to do all this," he said to Franz one afternoon as they worked side by side, building a new gate for the pasture. "We need to," Franz replied. "We need to know that we did something good, that we gave something back." On their last full day at the farm, Thompson arrived with official transfer orders and something else, a camera. "The colonel wants documentation," he explained. "Wants to show that prisoners can be rehabilitated, that the work program is successful. Mind if I take some photographs?" Henri hesitated, then nodded. "But not of their faces. If you take pictures, leave them their dignity. No prisoner numbers, no identification, just men working." Thompson agreed, and he spent the afternoon capturing images, Prisoners mending fences, feeding animals, carrying firewood. Henri and Marguerite standing with shovels. Sophie scattered grain for the chickens, her face turned toward the sky, her mouth open in a song the camera couldn't capture. That evening, the final evening, Marguerite prepared a feast with the supplies Thompson had brought. She made real bread with white flour, a chicken roasted with herbs from her dried garden stores, potatoes mashed with real butter, carrots glazed with honey. The table was set with her good dishes, the ones she had hidden during the occupation. White porcelain with blue flowers around the rim. Candles burned alongside the oil lamps, making the room glow like a sanctuary. Before they ate, Henri stood at the head of the table one last time. "Tomorrow you leave," he said, his voice steady but emotional. "Tomorrow you go to a camp, and from there, eventually, home. I want you to know what you have given us." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "You have given us our daughter's voice. You have worked harder than we had any right to ask. You have shown us that even in the darkest times, there are men who choose to be decent. But most of all, you have given us hope that when Mikel comes home, he will find a world that is healing, not a world that is still bleeding." Marguerite added, "You will always have a place at this table. If you survive this war, if you make it home, if you ever find yourselves in France again, you come here, you knock on this door, and we will remember you, not as Germans or prisoners, but as the young men who helped us in our hardest season." Sophie spoke then, her voice still fragile, but determined. "I hated you when you arrived. I hated your uniforms, your language, everything you represented. But Franz asked me in writing if I was sorry, and I realized he had asked the wrong question. The right question is not whether we are sorry for what was done. The right question is, what will we do now? How will we choose to live in the aftermath?" She looked around the table at each prisoner. "You chose to work with dignity. You chose to accept kindness you did not deserve. You chose to help us instead of resenting us. These choices matter. They are how we rebuild." The meal was eaten slowly, savored, each bite a communion of sorts. They told stories. Otto spoke of his dairy farm and his daughters singing. Klaus recounted teaching history to students who would now have to live through history's most terrible chapter. Wilhelm described his mother's Christmas tradition of the extra police setting and how he finally understood its meaning. Franz told them about his best friend Peter, who had died in Poland, who had been a gentle soul forced into violence, and who had wept the first time he had to shoot at another human being. Peter used to say that every person we met was someone's child, someone's beloved. He said we should remember that before we pulled the trigger. The officers beat him for saying such things. They called him weak. But he was the strongest person I knew because he refused to let the war make him into something inhuman. He would have liked this, Klaus said quietly, this table, this family. He would have said this is what we were fighting for, even though we were on the wrong side. As the evening deepened, Henri brought out another bottle of wine, and this time he poured more generously. They drank toasts to peace, to healing, to the hope that they would all see their families again, to Mikel's recovery, to Sophie's voice, to the possibility of a world where enemies could become, if not friends, then at least fellow humans who had survived the same storm. Near midnight, as the candles burned low, Franz asked permission to speak. Henri nodded, and Franz stood, his heart pounding with the weight of what he needed to say. "I was taught many lies. I was taught that my nation was superior, that other peoples were lesser, that conquest was our destiny. I was taught to see uniforms and flags instead of faces. I was taught that mercy was weakness. You have taught me different truths. You have shown me that mercy is the hardest kind of strength.
You have proven that humanity persists even when everything conspires to destroy it. You have given me something I thought I had lost forever. Hope that I can be more than what the war made me."
He reached into his pocket and pulled out something he had made during the long evenings in the barn. It was a small carving, made from a piece of scrap wood, shaped with a borrowed knife and countless hours of careful work. It was a bird, wings spread, taking flight. "I made this for you, Sophie, because your voice came back, like a bird returning after a long winter. Because you taught me that silence can end, that wounds can heal, that we are not forever defined by our worst moments." Sophie took the carving, with tears streaming down her face. She turned it over in her hands, examining every detail, the careful feathers, the open beak, the sense of movement frozen in wood. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "I will keep it always. I will remember." One by one, the other prisoners presented their own gifts. Otto had woven a basket from willow branches, perfect for carrying eggs. Klaus had written out poems from memory, French and German verses, copied in his careful teacher's hand, bound together with string. Wilhelm had carved wooden spoons, each one different, each one fitted to a specific purpose: stirring, serving, tasting. These gifts, simple and made from whatever materials they could find, represented more than craftsmanship. They were apologies and promises, tangible proof that 12 German soldiers had been changed by the kindness of one French family. Henri accepted each gift with gravity, placing them on the table like sacred objects. "We will use these every day," he said. "We will remember you every time we gather eggs, every time we stir a pot, every time we read these poems. You will be part of our family's story, part of how we survived and what we became." The night ended with an unexpected request from Marguerite. "Will you sing for us?" she asked. "A German song, something from home. I want to know what you hear when you think of peace." The prisoners looked at each other uncertainly, but Klaus nodded and began. His voice, trained by years of teaching, carried a folk song from the Rhineland, a simple melody about harvest and home. One by one, the others joined in, their voices rough but earnest, singing not in defiance, but in longing, not in pride, but in grief for everything the war had stolen from all of them. When the song ended, Sophie sang back, a French lullaby, something her mother had sung to her as a child. Her voice was fragile but true, and in that moment, in that kitchen with candlelight flickering on the faces of former enemies, something like peace took root. They slept that last night in the barn, but none of them slept deeply. They were too aware that morning would bring separation, that the strange sanctuary they had found would dissolve with the dawn. Franz lay awake listening to the animals shift and breathe, memorizing the smell of hay and wood smoke, trying to capture every detail so he could carry this place with him through whatever came next. When dawn came, cold and clear, they gathered in the yard. Thompson had arrived early with the transport truck. The prisoners loaded their few possessions, the blankets they had been given, which Henri insisted they keep, extra food Marguerite had packed, letters they had written to their families that Thompson promised to help send. The goodbyes were painful in their tenderness. Henri embraced each man, speaking words of blessing in German, telling them to be safe, to go home, to build good lives. Marguerite pressed packages of food into their hands, her face wet with tears, telling them to eat, to survive, to remember that they were worthy of love despite everything. Sophie stood before Franz last. She had her wooden bird clutched in one hand, and with the other, she reached up and removed a small silver chain from around her neck. On it hung a medal of Saint Christopher, patron saint of travelers. "For your journey," she said, her voice stronger now, more certain. "So you find your way home, so you remember that you can be forgiven. so you never forget that voices can return even after a long silence. Franz took the medal with shaking hands and put it around his neck. "I will never forget," he promised. "I will tell your story. I will tell people that in the winter of 1944, a French family taught 12 German soldiers what it means to be human." As the truck pulled away, Franz looked back through the canvas opening. Henri, Marguerite, and Sophie stood in the yard, 3 figures growing smaller in the distance, waving until the truck turned a corner and they disappeared from view. But they didn't disappear from his heart, from his memory, from the story that would shape the rest of his life. 3 months later, Franz sat in the POW camp near Munich, waiting for the final processing that would send him home to Berlin. The war had ended. Hitler was dead. The Reich had fallen. The world was sorting through the rubble, trying to understand what had happened and how to prevent it from happening again. He had told the story of the farm many times in the camp, to anyone who would listen. Some thought he was lying, that no French family would have shown such kindness. Others wept when they heard it, desperate to believe that mercy still existed somewhere in the broken world. One prisoner, a man named Dieter from Hamburg, asked the question that haunted them all. "Do you think we deserve forgiveness?" Franz touched the St. Christopher medal at his neck. "I think we have to earn it every day for the rest of our lives. I think forgiveness is not a gift we receive once, but a possibility we have to honor with our choices." Henri didn't forgive us. That would have been too simple. He gave us something harder, the chance to become men worth forgiving. When Franz finally made it back to Berlin, he found his mother's apartment building still standing, though damaged. She was alive, thin and aged by hardship, but alive. When she saw him at the door, she collapsed into her arms, and they held each other for a long time, 2 survivors of a catastrophe trying to find solid ground.
That night, as they shared watery soup and hard bread, Franz told her about the farm, about Henri and Marguerite and Sophie, about the table that had been set for enemies, about the bird he had carved and the medal he wore. His mother listened without interrupting, tears running down her face. "You must go back," she said when he finished. "Someday, when you can, you must return to that farm and show them what you became. Show them that their mercy was not wasted." Franz found work as a laborer, helping rebuild Berlin from the ruins. It would be years before he could resume his architectural studies, but he worked with his hands and learned about construction from the ground up. Every building he helped raise felt like an act of redemption, a way to create instead of destroy, to build instead of tear down. He wrote letters to the Beaumont farm, but received no reply. He didn't know if the letters were reaching them, or if the postal system was still too disrupted by war's aftermath. He kept writing anyway, sending updates about his life, about the rebuilding, about his determination to become the man Henri had believed he could be. 2 years later, Franz stood at the door of the Beaumont farmhouse, his heart pounding. He had saved every spare mark, traveled for 3 days by train and bus, and walked the last 5 kilometers from the village. The farm looked exactly as he remembered. The stone house with faded blue shutters, the barn behind it, smoke rising from the chimney. He knocked, uncertain if he would be welcome, uncertain if they even remembered him. The door opened. Henri stood there, older, grayer, but his eyes still steady and clear. For a moment he simply stared at Franz. Then his face broke into a smile. "The architect returns," he said in German. "Come in, come in." Inside, the kitchen was warm and filled with the smell of bread. Marguerite was at the stove, and she turned, her hand flying to her mouth when she saw him.
"Franz," she whispered, and suddenly she was embracing him, this enemy soldier who had sat at her table, this young man who had become part of their story. Sophie appeared in the doorway, no longer a girl but a young woman. Her voice was strong now, confident. "You came back," she said. "I promised I would tell your story, but first I needed to see how it continued." They sat at the familiar table, and Henri told him about Michel's return, how he had come home thin and haunted but alive, how he was slowly healing, working the farm again, relearning how to live without fear. "Michel was in the village today," Henri explained, "but would be home by evening." Franz reached into his bag and pulled out a rolled paper. "I brought something." He unrolled it carefully. Architectural drawings for a small chapel, simple and beautiful, designed to honor all those lost in the war, regardless of which side they had fought on. "I'm studying again. I'm becoming an architect, and I wanted you to see that your mercy created something. You saved more than 12 prisoners. You saved the possibility that we could become builders instead of remaining destroyers." That evening, when Michel returned, Franz met the man whose imprisonment had indirectly led to his own salvation. They shook hands carefully, two men connected by grief and survival, and Michel said something that Franz would carry forever. "My father set a table for you when I was starving in a camp. Somehow I felt it. Somehow I knew that if mercy still existed somewhere, I could survive to find it." They ate dinner together, all of them around that scarred wooden table. And as darkness fell and candles were lit, Franz understood that Henri had been right all along. Mercy was not weakness. It was the hardest kind of strength, the kind that broke cycles and planted seeds and gave broken men a chance to become whole.